Season 3 for Food for Thought. And we are so lucky that we have Sara Stratton here with us again from Remission Nutrition. My name is Stacy Fritz. I am one of the patient advocates for Believe Big. And what I do during the Food for Thought series is I invite in an oncology nutritionist intentionally. I work with folks in nutrition, but I also know my lane and I don't have that specialty area. So it's very important for us when we dive into topics that you have in front of you somebody who is well versed in the subject matter and who is able to talk on oncology nutrition. So that's Sara, and she's coming in with us from Remission Nutrition. There's no need for you all to take notes on anything today because first, we are recording. And second, if you do need access to me or Sara, I will give you that information at the end of our session today. That said, we're going to get started. So I'm hopeful that you all read why you are here. The topic is fascinating, and I am really excited to dive into the content with Sara. We're going to be talking about the impact of intermittent fasting on the cancering journey. So like always, when we bring in some of these topics where they tend to be trending and perhaps a little highlighted right now in the media, it's important that we level set the conversation. And what I mean by that is I'm going to ask Sara and pass the baton to her to kick us off with explaining what exactly is intermittent fasting. You probably do know. However, all of us translate the information a little differently, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page when Sara dives deeper into this content. So welcome, Sara, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, kind of translating and describing the different types of fasting, I think is important. So we're all kind of like talking about the same thing. And so I think of fasting in a few different categories. So let me kind of share what I think in my head and then also what some of the literature says. So I think about circadian rhythm eating as one of the kind of basic fasting modalities, and that's just kind of eating with our sleep and wake cycle. So to me, that means kind of eating before the sun goes down, and then starting eating again a little bit after the sun comes up. And that's a circadian rhythm fast to me. And I think the most basic fast that our human and our human evolution is kind of like most in alignment with. And there's a lot of benefits just to kind of eating with our circadian rhythm and fasting in that way. And then intermittent fasting is kind of described as like a 12 to 18 hour fasting window per day. So that could mean like, stopping eating at like 5 p.m. one day and then not eating until 7 to 9 to 10 the next day. And so that's intermittent fast. So around 12 to 18 hours between taking in calories. And then there's longer duration fasts. And so those are kind of like the fasts that you might have heard about for extending and prolonged fasts. That could be 48 to 72 hours for other types of therapeutic benefits that we sometimes use with oncology nutrition in combination with sometimes conventional treatments. So those are kind of some of the most basic fasts, and I think there's a lot of variability in between those. But that's kind of how I think about it, is like the circadian fast, the intermittent fast, and the prolonged fast, and those could be used for different people and for different use cases.
And so when we say, and thank you for that. So I'm going to look at this as three buckets, as you just mentioned. We have one that we're following the natural rhythm of the sun going up and down, where we are fasting when the sun is down, of course. And then the second one you mentioned is intermittent fasting, where we are not consuming calories and the other things that we're going to get into for a chunk of time. So it could be 12 hours that we are fasting and with a window of 8 hours of eating, or it could be all the way up to say 18 hours of fasting. And then finally, when we put into place a fasting that is longer than that, where we're not eating, consuming any calories for 48, even 72 hours. I mean, that's a really, really long time. And I know we are going to go there on that. But when we say the word fasting, Sara, and I get this question a lot, what would break a fast? Are we saying no calories? Is a fasting zero consumption of calories? What about like liquids? So I just want to be super clear with our listeners that fasting can be broken very easily, unintentionally, is what I'm trying to say. So could you just define the word fasting? What are we not doing and what are we allowed to do?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to like the reason for the fast too, right? So when we think about breaking a fast, yeah, usually calories is going to break a fast. So anything that has calories in it, in theory, could break a fast. But sometimes I think about it in, well, what's the reason why we are fasting? Because if it's more to give our gut a reset, right? Then maybe it's important to have no calories in us. But maybe if it's a fasting protocol, just to support our metabolism and metabolic health. Sometimes in my mind, we can use some fat calories to support us in that fasting to stabilize our blood sugar. So I kind of go back to like, well, what's the reason why we're fasting? Is it gut reset? Is it to reduce our insulin and support our metabolism and bring in some metabolic flexibility? Is it to get into kind of deeper ketosis and stimulate some autophagy? So I think that all in my mind kind of depends on like what's going to break a fast. And so if it's, something that we're just trying to use to get into ketosis or to support metabolic flexibility, yes, no calories, but we can also use sometimes some fat calories just to kind of stabilize the blood sugar.
Mm.
But if it's like for a true water fast and we want to challenge ourselves that way and a gut reset, then it's, in my mind, no calories, but we could use things like, non-caloric teas and coffee and water and electrolytes and things like that to support us during the fast.
Good. Well, that sounds like it could get really confusing right away. So let me ask it this way. And I try as the moderator to think of questions that I think that may be coming from our listeners, but please know, and I see Francis is asking a question. I'm so thankful. Just know that this is an interactive session. We're not talking about specific diagnosis, but however, when we get to each section, I will pause for a second and I will look at the chat and make sure that there's no additional questions from you all. It's not just me, it's all of you all too. So Francis, I saw yours. Just give me 1 second. I want to ask the question about, let's start with somebody who's not on the cancering journey. Would you say, I know that there's absolutes are tough, but would you say intermittent fasting, one of those three buckets, is good for anyone? I mean, is there a good argument about, is it healthy for everybody to do this occasionally? I know the reason you're going to probably drill into knowing your reason why, but I'm just curious to know, what's the rule of thumb about intermittent fasting? Is it good for all of us?
I think back to like blanket terms, like I think everybody's an individual. So kind of when I come at prescribing, maybe not prescribing, recommending a fasting protocol, because I don't
Right.
prescribe, but I might recommend it to people. It kind of goes back to the reason why. But I think in general, most people that I work with and talk to in my daily life can benefit from some intermittent fasting.
Mm.
I kind of thinking about a story, kind of think about my husband. And I used to have to feed him constantly because whenever his blood sugar would drop, he would get really grumpy, right? Because his body didn't know how to switch between glucose metabolism and fat metabolism, so he would
Mm.
get hangry. And so a way that I've um, coached him around that is by introducing intermittent fasting to him, just like 12 to 16 hours a day of not eating. And that gives his body ability and time in the morning to start to burn fat for fuel
Mm.
and use a different part of his metabolism so he's not just relying on glucose. And that helps him go longer between meals and have his glucose more stable so he doesn't get that hangry feeling where I feel like
Yes,
got to have all these snacks around for him. And
sure.
I find that with him and a lot of my clients is just, a little bit of intermittent fasting, nothing too stressful, nothing too strenuous, but just a little bit of fasting kind of through the morning. Sometimes just to kind of like help us use different fuel systems. And there's a lot of benefit of using not just glucose for our energy and fuel, but to dip into our fat for energy and fuel.
Yes, yes. Well, that's a great explanation. So moving over to, if that's somebody who's not on the cancering journey, why is the research sharing? Can you give us a general overview why on the cancering journey would we bring in intermittent fasting? What is the theory behind that? I think I know, but I just would love for you to explain to our listeners, why do we use that?
Yeah, there are quite a few studies around fasting during the cancer journey. And some of the mechanisms of action around fasting and cancer is one to reduce mTOR. So mTOR is kind of like a growth accelerator for cancer cells, along with insulin. So a lot of cancer cells have additional insulin receptors on them. And so the theory is that we could use fasting, the absence of calories, to reduce insulin and mTOR intermittently. And so that could be used along different treatment modalities to support our body going through different, whether it's, chemotherapy or for hyperbaric oxygen, or just in general to reduce insulin a little bit, because
Mm.
back to some of the studies, even along the lines of the Warburg effect, our body can use glucose and insulin as different kind of metabolic pathways to kind of fuel some cancer cells.
So we should probably mention for our listeners who don't know that the body's preferred fuel source just on the outset is going to be the glucose, right? And so am I correct in sharing that? So what you're saying, switching between using the metabolic pathway of fat, using fat storage to energize or provide the energy source. This is one of the reasons why intermittent fasting is so great, is that we have the ability to become metabolically flexible, to be able to switch on and off which source of energy the body. I think it's correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. The body's preferred is glucose, but in order to get us into a different pathway, we've got to deny on the one. So which is part of the reason. Correct?
Yeah, and I think our body prefers what it gets mostly, right? So it prefers glucose because for most of us, that's the
Yes.
majority of what we eat is carbohydrates. And so it's very used to using glucose for fuel. But sometimes also if we train it in certain ways to use fat and fatty acids or our internal fat for fuel, if we think about different macronutrients, like glucose can be fuel, fat can be fuel, protein is not fuel, but it's kind of like the underlying
Yes.
macronutrient that supports tissue repair. And so I always think about like, how can our body use both glucose and fat for fuel so that we have like kind of like a hybrid engine, right? So when
Oh, I
one
love that.
runs out, we can kind of use the other one. And then we don't kind of get those like energy slumps during the day because our body can quickly switch. So when we run out of glucose, we can tap into fat. And then if we run out of fat, our body can kind of pull endogenous glucose out of our liver to kind of fuel us. So
I
it's kind
love
of this
that.
nice system that our body inherently has in it. But the majority of people only use the glucose system. So that's why, the body prefers it.
Sara, I love the hybrid engine. So I'm hoping our listeners, I'm going to pause for a minute, like I promised. I'm going to get a hold of Frances' question first, but I'm also going to give folks a chance to pop in the chat up until this point, not what she hasn't spoken about or what you haven't heard the answer to your question, but of the things that we've talked about right now, the different ways to intermittent fast, why healthy folks that are not on the cancering journey, that could benefit for them. And then for those even healthy on the cancering journey, how we go about intermittent fasting when we're on the cancering journey. So any questions about that, pop them in the chat. In the meantime, Frances would like to know, Sara, what about bone broth and mineral broth? Is that okay during a fast? Maybe you could share a little insight on that.
Yeah, I think, Francis, it just goes back to what your goal for fasting is. I can kind of pull out a personal experience. I'm a breast cancer survivor myself, and so I went through chemotherapy, and I use bone broth fasting during my chemotherapy to reduce my insulin and to kind of like put my kind of healthy cells kind of at a stable state to make the chemotherapy potentially target the cancer cells more effectively. But I use bone broth during that chemotherapy instead of a water fast to mineralize my body. And because I was extending the fast a little bit for 3 days, that bone broth just really helped with my electrolyte balance. So I think depending on the reason, it doesn't have to be even for chemotherapy, right? If your reason is just to reduce insulin, to reduce calorie load, to do maybe some fasting mimicking, I think bone broth can be used. It just kind of goes back to your purpose. And if bone broth makes your fast easier, then I think it's a great option.
And she also asked, but the mineral broth or the bone broth would also be a situation where you would be breaking a fast. I understand that, that there would be a understanding why we're doing the fasting in the first place, but
Yeah.
in general, bone broth would break a fast.
If you want to think about fast as like a traditional water fast, then yes, bone broth has calories. But I want to share a little bit about the fasting mimicking diet because I feel like that might be helpful. So there's a scientific researcher named Walter Longo, and he coined the fasting mimicking diet. And there's a lot of research for the fasting mimicking diet for longevity, for metabolic health in general, for non-cancer, but also using the fasting mimicking diet in combination with chemotherapy and other treatments, whether, what other path somebody's on. And that is having a small amount of calories per day, but still sending your body a message that is in a fasting state. And the research with the fasting mimicking diet, even though you're having some calories, is still very strong. So I don't want to give people the impression that fasting is all or nothing. I think there is benefit to nothing, having nothing, but I think there is benefit to bringing in a little bit of calories sometimes during your fast, even though it's not a traditional water fast, to make it easier and less stressful on your body.
Oh, great.
So
That's awesome.
it's hard, with fasting, I feel like so many people want, really strict guidelines.
Yes.
But being a faster for 6 years and experimenting with all different types of fasts, I feel like there's benefits for all the different types of fasts. And I don't think we need to be stuck in the dogma of doing it right or wrong. I think the benefit is reducing the calories, reducing the insulin, the glucose, the carbohydrates, the mTOR, and then giving our body, some minerals to be able to kind of more efficiently get through the fast a little bit
And I think
easier.
really what you're saying too is what we say each and every time, which is there is not a one size fits all for any of this. And this is about figuring out what's best for you and how you feel and what the goal and objective is. I think, Lori, I'm hoping that what Sara just explained answered your question. But Sara, I'm going to give you the question as she presented it. She says, I'm a big believer in intermittent fasting. In your opinion, what's the best way to incorporate intermittent fasting, say, if you're going to start chemo next week? She was thinking a 24-hour fast once per week, and she would love to know your thoughts. So before you answer it, Sara, Lori, just so you know, we don't tackle individual scenarios. So I'm going to reframe the question in a different way. And if you need more specifics, I'm going to put you in touch directly with Sara. I'm hoping that's okay with you. We just can't do each because Sara doesn't know you and she doesn't want to give you information or advice that, would not be in your best interest. But let's reframe it and say, what would be if somebody wants to do some intermittent fasting and they're going to start a chemo regime, whether it's oral or an infusion or however it's being done, is there a way to try that? And what would be the reason? She's thinking like a 24-hour fast once per week. I mean, do you like that strategy for somebody, or is it, again, I'm pushing you on the depends?
Yeah, I can talk about what the research shows around chemotherapy and why we do it for chemotherapy. So the research shows that if we can fast through chemotherapy, kind of put our healthy cells a little bit into hibernation, it in theory makes the chemotherapy target the cancer cells more effectively. And then the studies, it also shows that it reduces side effects. So it can reduce GI side effects, it can reduce fatigue, it can reduce nausea, all of those things that we think of with chemotherapy. It can be protective. And then we also see that if we fast sometimes during chemotherapy, our blood cell counts are more stable, so we are less likely to have to skip sessions. And so I can say that from as my experience, as well as I fasted through chemotherapy, I feel like I had some side effects. I'm not going to lie. I had some side effects, but also I was able to stay on my chemotherapy regimens and not have to take breaks. And so my body was very resilient through it. So the research around chemotherapy and fasting, what they've done in the studies is done a fasting protocol for 3 to 5 days. So it's probably a little bit more intense than a 24-hour, where they have somebody, and this is probably for a chemotherapy cycle that's every 3 weeks. So if somebody has a chemotherapy cycle every week or every other week, it might be a little bit different. But in the studies where they did an every 3-week chemotherapy cycle, they fasted somebody 1 to 2 days before chemotherapy, the day of chemotherapy, and then 1 or 2 days after chemotherapy. And that could be water fasting. That could be the fasting mimicking diet. That could be a bone broth fast. I think it goes back to the individual person, how metabolically flexible they are, how active they are, and then how often their chemotherapy is, because we don't want to, if somebody's doing weekly chemotherapy, that might be a little taxing to do every week. But that's what the studies have shown to be effective in reducing side effects.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that. Okay. Any other questions before we keep going here? Okay. So, Sara, my question, this is coming from me. Let's say somebody is really interested in working with you in terms of fasting, and you think it's a good idea, whatever part of the journey they're on. How does one decide where it may be a little bit redundant from the last answer, but how do you decide where you start with this? If somebody is, if they're not going to go out on it on their own and they're going to be working with you, how do you make the decision where to start somebody?
I think I start with like where they're at and how metabolically healthy they are right then. Because if somebody, back to kind of like what engine they're using, if they're using a glucose engine 90% of the time, 100% of the time, getting them right into like a 24 or 48-hour fast is going to be really hard on their body because they're just not
Yeah.
used to moving into that engine. So what I might do for them if they're not metabolically healthy at that time is just like you said, like try some intermittent fasting, right? And my favorite is just the circadian rhythm fast. So trying to have an earlier dinner, maybe closing the dinner window around 5 p.m. And then try not to have any calories after that, maybe just some tea. And then opening up your eating window the next day around 8, 8 or 9. And that's kind of a nice 14 to 15-hour fast. And that's just starting to train our body to be able to kind of go between fuel sources and then maybe gradually working out from there. But it's all kind of like experimentation, like, hey, let's test this out for a few days. Let's see how you feel. Can we graduate? Can we go a little bit longer?
Yeah.
And so it's just, yeah, it's
It's
an
so
individual.
It's a kind of a little bit counterintuitive, though, for me anyway, and working with folks, is that, here we're saying that this is healthy and all the great research behind it. But if I look at this from a different lens, this looks like calorie restriction. And for
Yeah.
forever, growing up, we're like, you don't deny the body calories because then they're just going to hold on to these fat stores. I mean, how do you explain the rationale between the caloric restriction, the
Yeah.
fast, and how denying the body calories can be a good thing when for many of us we were taught something totally different.
Yeah. Well, I think in general, I think it's about 6 to 8% of Americans are metabolically healthy. So 90+% of people are probably overeating on calories
Yes,
anyways.
yes.
And so we could use the fasting time window as just a way for some caloric reduction to get them probably to where we should be anyways.
Right.
And so I think, some people need a little bit of caloric restriction as well, especially if we want to think about cancer prevention, because adiposity and obesity are one of the drivers of cancer. And so if we can reduce body fat, we can give people a better chance at resilience. And if they are in remission, keeping them in remission. So I think about caloric restriction as a strategy and one of
Yes.
the tools in the toolbox. And fasting is one of the ways to get to caloric restriction, but it doesn't mean they have to stay there forever. Once we get them into a metabolically healthy range for their body weight and for their fat and carbohydrate glucose burning system.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm going to make sure that I'm just going to check the chat real quick and make sure thus far we don't have additional questions. Okay, this is a good one. You ready, Sara?
Yeah.
Julie asked, what about those of us who are a bit too thin?
Mhm.
What is your position on they might need the calories and
Yeah.
and being worried about losing more weight during a fasting cycle?
Yeah. I think and then that kind of goes back to individuality too, because somebody could be thin, but they could have fat on the inside. And
Yes,
so
yeah.
that's something that we don't, that's called TOFI kind of thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And we don't know the case for each person, but that's one thing that we look at. And then if somebody just is a thinner person, because some people's body styles are just thin, and then going through, if they went through treatments, it might have been harder to eat, or we're just, they're just naturally thin. I might not do as much fasting, but I might still work on the metabolic flexibility, to bring in healthy fats to reduce glucose and insulin, but to help them maintain weight. Because if we think about the macronutrients, fats, when we eat healthy fats like olive oil and
Avocado. Yep.
avocados and fatty fish, those healthy fats don't raise our glucose,
Right.
whereas carbohydrates raise our glucose, and protein can raise our glucose a little bit. So in that circumstance, when I'm working with somebody that's kind of on the underweight side or the thinner side, I might kind of prioritize fat fasts. So they're having fats in the eating window, but maybe not as much carbohydrates and protein.
Love that. Love that. That's a really great way to take a look at it, that we're switching between sources of our macronutrients in order to be able to fuel the body in a way that is, not depleting and not pulling necessarily more. But just to remind our listeners that even though a calorie is still a calorie, there are the kinds of efficiency of our calories. And so we want to, just to drive me crazy when my brother was on his journey, that things that like an Ensure, like those Ensure shakes, to make sure that they were putting in calories. And let me just say, I'm not picking on the Ensure, I'm just using it as an example, but I promise you that is not the source that needs to be going in, right? So we want to be really intentional about the calories that we're consuming on or off the journey, period, right? So I use the example in my work, then I'll say, like, if we put a plate of a hamburger and French fries and ketchup and all the things, and then we can do the same size plate, but we load it up with vegetables and lean protein. That's a lesson on volumetrics. It's like the plate with the chicken and the vegetables is like 3 times the size of what that same caloric exchange would be. Plus you've got the saturated fat and, just unhealthier things, like high sodium, processed foods and whatnot. So regardless of how we're fasting, we still need to be paying attention to the kinds of calories that we're consuming on or off the journey, right?
Yeah. Can I
So
add something, Stacy,
yes,
that I think
please, please.
you'll be appreciative too, is that I'm really mindful when I work with my clients and myself on a fasting protocol that we talked about, like a lot of people are metabolically unhealthy, and some people might have fat to lose and to change body composition. But if we do a lot of fasting, but we don't have a strength training or
Mm,
weight bearing exercises alongside of the fasting, we can lose muscle.
mm.
And so that kind of goes back to the bio individuality, but I like to always encourage people, if they have a fasting protocol, to also have a strength training protocol alongside of it, so that we're not losing muscle mass while we're fasting.
And to have that really good integrity to our lean muscle tissue is so
Mhm.
important. Now you really, I did appreciate that comment very much. I want to make sure our listeners have no questions, because what Sarah's saying is that we support our lean muscle tissue with nutrition, but we maintain and grow lean muscle tissue with resistance training. And that's my wheelhouse for sure. I mean, I cannot tell you how the research about the benefits of resistance training. So wherever you are on the journey, being able to incorporate, we're not talking about getting in the gym and racking up really heavy steel weights. That's not necessarily, if that's your jam, you should do that. However, we're talking about body weighted exercises, resistance band exercises, dumbbells. Find a way, and of course you can reach out here as well, to do a gentle resistance program. Not that I want to steer us off topic, but I was just speaking with another doctor about a different kind of scenario. And a lot of our folks are asking question, not through Believe Big, through outside of Believe Big, on the Ozempic conversation. And it's similar, because if you're going to be using a drug of that nature, the next part of the period at the end of the sentence, and then the next sentence is, you make sure that you are consuming a high quality lean protein,
Mhm.
1 gram per desired body weight goal. That part's not important. What's important is the value and the level of high priority that we need to be taking a look at our sourcing for lean protein, and that we're so intentional about how much protein that we're using, which brings me to my next question.
Mhm.
So if we're doing everything that you working with you or not working with you, we're trying this out. I'm thinking along the lines of, okay, it's over. The fasting is over. The 12-hour, the 13-hour,
Mhm.
14-hour, 18-hour, 72-hour, whatever it is. I got to believe the first thing that goes in has got to count. So
Yeah.
can you talk to us about breaking the fast and what kinds of things that we want to be mindful of when we come
Yeah.
out of a fasting scenario?
Yeah. One of the benefits of the fast itself is to trigger autophagy and cellular turnover. But we need calories and good quality macronutrients to build back brand new cells that are strong and resilient. And I also think about just how we're going to feel coming out of the fast. So if we're fasting forever, however long our glucose has lowered, right? The first meal that we want to bring back in my eyes should be something lower carbohydrate, because we don't want to go from 60 to 70 glucose to 150 glucose. That is really hard on our bodies. That's really hard on my mitochondria. We're not going to feel really good after that. So something that I recommend is kind of back to Francis, like the bone broth. Like bone broth to remineralize after the fast is great, because you're getting some protein, you're getting some minerals, the great amino acids. Sometimes I'll throw a little bit of coconut milk in the bone broth for some a little bit extra healthy fats. And that's going to kind of keep the blood sugar stable as you start to reintroduce more foods throughout the day. And I like the idea of doing something easy on digestion, because we've turned off digestion for a little bit, and our
Mm.
digestive enzymes are like, I haven't had food coming in. Maybe I don't have as many as I need to. So that first meal that we reintroduce, we might not have the salivary enzymes to break down that food. So doing a soup, a bone broth, maybe even like a protein fat smoothie is like just a gentle way to reintroduce foods to support our digestion and our mitochondria and our energy for the rest of the day.
I love that. I love that. Okay, we do have a question, but we're going to come back to that in just a second. So the question is, would you maybe add in a little collagen or a little protein powder into that too? Would you, or would you say that's doubling down?
I guess if it's a bone broth, bone broth itself has some good protein in it, so I wouldn't need to add much to that. But if I had a smoothie, I would definitely add in some bone broth protein powder or collagen to get those amino acids, to help with tissue repair and to help kind of just, give our cells those building blocks that we kind of missed out on for a little bit. And we brought down mTOR for a little bit, but we don't want to keep mTOR down forever. So we want to have like a little bit of an anabolic signal back online to send a message to our muscles that, hey,
Hmm.
we still need you guys here too.
Yeah. So maybe this is a little too deep on this one, but I'm curious, how do we know that we are in that good, if we're not working with you, how are we measuring our fast? Besides just being able to make it,
Yeah.
and being able to come out of it, is there a way to test whether or not we are where we need to be? And how do you test metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with, how do I test metabolic flexibility? It's a hard thing to test. And I think one way I test metabolic flexibility is the ability to fast easily,
Mm,
because that means our body is able to switch into that fat burning zone a little bit more efficiently. So that, to me, that we have metabolic flexibility if we are able to go 12, 16, 18, 24 hours without food. That's one sign of kind of that. And for testing during the fast, it just kind of goes back to the goal, right? Like for me as the oncology nutritionist, we work with our clients if they are interested in like a ketogenic diet. And so one of the goals we have for them sometimes is using the fast as a way to increase ketones. And
yes.
so we'll use something like a keto mojo meter to test ketones and glucose to see where they're at. Something that's interesting is that as we get more ketones on board, we feel better through the fast, because that's a sign that our body
I
is
switched
metabolic
over.
flexibility. It's switched over to that fat burning. It's pulling out fat from our endogenous kind of fat stores and using those to produce ketones. And so usually, like, I'm going to give an example of like a longer fast. Usually, like if somebody is new to fasting and they do a 24 to 36 hour fast, they might be like, oh, I don't feel good. I'm getting kind of hungry. I'm getting kind of weak. And then maybe around hour 36 to 48, your ketones start to increase. And then you're like, oh, I can do this. This feels
Yeah.
better, right? And so sometimes it's once those ketones come on board for the people that are doing the longer fast, you start to feel better because you have those ketones to support your energy levels.
Very good. Very good. So here's a question from Rebecca. She's done 2 3-day fasts, and on the third day, her blood sugar has drastically dropped, and it ended up being like around 45. Again, in a more generic question format, what would be a reason for the blood sugar dropping? Would she need something like more electrolytes?
I mean, the blood sugar is mostly dropping just from the absence of calories, and that's pretty common on a 3-day fast. And I think, just wanted to kind of put out something too, is that whatever fasting you're trying to do, whether it's a small fast or long fast, make sure that you have, some physician guidance and some support from your medical team. But in general, what we see for people that are doing those longer fasts is that if they have low blood sugar, around 50, usually they have pretty good ketones. And so those ketones are continuing to give them the energy. I do worry if somebody has low blood sugar and low ketones, because then their body's not having any energy. And so
Mm,
I think the 3-day fast, the low blood sugar is just from not having the calories, right? And electrolytes might not help increase your blood sugar, but they can make you feel better because electrolytes are really important during a fast to help make us feel better and help just support our balance and everything like that through a fast and energy. Um, and if somebody gets to day 3 and they have really low blood sugar and they're not feeling good, then that's a sign that, okay, the body's a little bit stressed. It might be time to come out of the fast. But if they have those ketones on board, they might feel fine.
yeah. And again, it goes back to nobody likes to hear it, but the answer is depends. And you really
Yeah.
do have to be monitored and watch, which brings me to my next part, which I'm going to circle back from the electrolyte conversation or electrolyte question. I also want you to talk about the importance of if you are doing that water fast, that our sourcing of our water needs to be looking at. So we were talking about before tips for success. For me personally, in this one, this is like a high priority one because I always think of these like cells inside and they are being deprived of whatever they're being deprived of. And we want to make sure that we're hydrating and putting
Mhm.
things in that are healthy. And we think water is mostly healthy, right? But we also know that some of our water sourcing probably needs to be cleaned up as well. So we just talk a little bit about the importance of, say, filtered water or um,
Yeah. Yeah, I
oxygenated
mean, I use
water.
with a lot of my clients, like I'll go on EWG's water database and
Yes.
put in their zip code, and then it will tell you how many toxins are outside of what should be acceptable. And that's a really great motivator to say, oh yeah, I probably should have a filter on my water system because one of the benefits of fasting is to reduce toxin load. But if we're
Yes.
only drinking water, we're keeping those toxins in us.
Right.
And we need like having adequate hydration is one of the keys to fasting success. There are countries and religions that do dry fasting. But I think using water during the fast is pretty important for most people. And then alongside of that, electrolytes just to keep our body balanced. And the electrolytes go into the cell and help the hydration of the cell. Without that electrolyte, we just kind of pee out all the water we're
Yeah,
drinking. So we want
yeah.
to make sure that our cells are absorbing the water, and electrolytes are one way to do that. So it could be, making a DIY electrolyte drink at home where you're using some sea salt and maybe some unsweetened aloe juice, which has 0 calories in it. It could be a little bit of baking soda. So we have, and I can share it with you, like a DIY electrolyte. And then we're okay with our clients using Element or something like
Yep.
that, like a
Yep.
non-caloric, electrolyte mix, just to kind of make the fast a little bit easier and give our body that electrolyte electric charge.
So important. Okay, so full disclosure, I am horrible at the pronouncing of this word. I don't know if you're looking in the chat, but Diana has a question about recommending fasting if a person has, and I'm not even going to try it because I'm going to butcher it and this is being recorded. So can you look at her because of the cancer? I, of course, know what that is, but I'm going to let you pronounce the word because I butcher it each and every time. Do you see it's
Oh,
Diana?
cachexia.
Yeah, say
Mhm.
it again so we can all learn it.
Cachexia.
Cachexia. That's
And
not how
that's
I pronounce it.
hopefully I'm saying it right, but it's, a form of muscle wasting that is
Yes, yes,
common
yeah,
during some cancer treatments or just as a side effect of having cancer itself. And the cancer is kind of stealing nutrients from our body. And then we're losing amino acids, and that usually comes alongside a high inflammation state. So
yeah,
cachexia usually means inflammation.
yeah.
And there have been studies that with cachexia, we might do a ketogenic diet, because ketogenic diets can be supportive against cachexia. And if we're doing fasting in a specific way, we can reduce inflammation. And so
Right.
back to the individualization, but there is a role in a little bit of fasting and maybe changing around the macronutrients to support our body to reduce inflammation. And there are some interesting studies online around cachexia and fasting and cachexia and the ketogenic diet that are pretty
So the
interesting.
when my brother was on the cancering journey, this was interesting because I think old school, I mean, our parents, everybody worries about this weight loss, quote unquote weight loss that happens on the cancering journey or sometimes happens on the cancering journey. And I'm just using my brother as an example. So if this is not you, I'm just sharing what this could look like and how confusing it can be. So we're always told don't lose weight, try to have as many calories. This is where the ensure conversation comes into
Mhm.
play. It's a little different when we're looking at it from this lens because one of the doctors that we had the pleasure of working with was we have our fighting weight, meaning my brother did need to lose a couple of pounds. Full disclosure, he really did. But when you have people that are saying don't lose weight, that becomes very cute, confusing to the person that isn't necessarily have their head in it the way we're talking about it right now. So this cachexia, right, is different than I would say the weight loss that he lost during keto and then also in his fasting journey, before and after chemo. He never felt better, right? And did he lose 20 pounds? He did, but he stayed really solid because we were focused in on lean proteins after and breaking the fast in the correct way.
Mhm.
And so I want to be super clear, two things that not all weight loss has to do with this cachexia. And
Mhm.
sometimes the shedding of some of the body extraneous inflammatory body fat that we didn't need anyway, in my brother's case, was kind of hard to wrap his brain around. So again, this would be a good reason to work with Sara. The second thing is Sara said it pretty quick, and I want to make sure that we didn't jump over it. She mentioned EWG, which stands for Environmental Working Group, which is a website that you can go to, and we'll put this in our show notes, that you can pop in where you live and the zip code, right? And it will return to you, no charge, an assessment of your public water. Okay. We shared that with you, not because we want you to go out and buy any one thing, but it is really valid information and a great argument to say, this is why you might want to have a filter on your water to do something like a Brita or, one of our Berkey or whatever it is, whatever brand you decide to use. I like to look at the numbers and the science. Is there a good reason to be doing it? And I love that EWG because it's a safe website. You're getting solid information. So check that out. I'm going to support Sara's comment as well, which is we want to make sure if that's all we're consuming, that it's a really good source, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
questions about that before we keep going?
And I
Everybody
just want to go back to the cachexia thing one more time. Cachexia is a medical diagnosis, right? And so we don't treat cachexia and we don't diagnose cachexia. But we also, I think, if somebody does have cachexia, even more of importance to bring on that strength training, weight bearing exercise
Yeah,
to support our lean body mass. So I'm always kind of paying attention to that. We look at labs to see if there's some muscle wasting going on. And so I'm always interested in like, is there any ability to provide load to our body to kind of send a message to our body to stay strong? So I
that's
always like
great.
to kind of put in that plug.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So we have one last question. We're getting there. We have no questions from our people out there, which is great. You must be answering all of them. But the last thing I want to put in front of you is, do you have any tips for success different than the things that we were talking about? Any ideas? Let's just say we're not quite ready to make the call to Sara. Where, like, what kinds of ways, hacks, tips, books,
Mhm.
anything like that, where we could just take a little deeper dive away from you first?
Yeah, I think as far as like resources, Mindy Pels has a lot of resources around fasting and a lot of interesting YouTube videos that kind of give some support around like breaking a fast and how to
What's the
stay
name again?
resilient. Dr. Mindy Pels, last
Pels.
name is Pels, Pelz. She has a book called Fast Like a Girl. Not that you have to be a
Oh,
girl to
yeah,
buy
yeah,
the
yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Um, but she goes into different types of fast and fasting links and how to support your body during a fast. In my mind, support is like going back to the purpose of the fast. What is your reason for the fast, right? And that can kind of help you identify like what type of fast is right for you. So, for my experience, like when I was going through my cancer treatment, my purpose was to support my body during chemotherapy and radiation. So maybe I was a little bit more aggressive during those fasts. But now, 6 years later, I'm an athlete. I want to maintain my lean body mass. I still use circadian rhythm fasting, but I might not be as strong on the extended fast because that's not my same goal as it was in the past. So I think it's just aligning to our purpose around the fast. And I think even going back to like the history of fasting, um, we've used fasting in a lot of different cultures, a lot of different religions just for mental reset and to tap into the internal self. And so, when we're doing fasting, I think it's a great time to do more meditation and work within to really kind of get the true benefits of the fast in kind of that absence period.
Mm, really interesting. This is so cool, Sara. What a great way to kick off season number 3. I want to invite us to do two things. If you have any questions before we wrap it up, I would invite you to put that in the chat. And then the second thing I would like to do before we head on out is, I'm putting you a little bit on the spot, not you, Sara, but you, everybody else, that we have planned out for food for thought the balance of the year. But I'm curious to know, if I were to ask you, is there a topic, something that has really been on your mind that per se we haven't covered as of yet, that we might take a look later in 2025? If you want to pop that in the chat, I'm always looking for different, I mean, of course, the list can go on forever and ever, but our goal, Sara and my goal, all of Believe Big, all of Remission Nutrition, is to be there for you all. And sometimes I do believe that we get so heady into the research that, not Sara, of course, not me, of course, but sometimes we forget that there's our questions and then there's your questions when we're looking at things from, a different place. So please, I would love to hear if you have any questions about the session today, and if there's a topic that's been on your mind that you'd like to see in future food for thought sessions. I'm doing my planning now for 2025. I'm so excited to be back with you all. I can't believe it's season number 3. And from all the great reach out, I really appreciate the feedback. We're doing really good work, Sara. You and we are doing some great things and paying it forward and passing along the information. That's how we serve. So allow us to do our job even better. If there is something that you'd like us to chat about in 2025, you can always send an email. I don't see anybody popping anything in right now. So I will say this. For my gal who would like to talk to Sara directly, I'm going to email you and I'm going to give you her contact information. If any of you would like to reach out, do so through me first, and I will pass you to her immediately. My email is Stacy, Stacy, at believebig.org. You don't have to worry about that because we have your email, and my email is going to be on that, repeat or that recording. So if you forget or you want me to, thank you. Thank you. So it's Stacy at believebig.org. And Sarah, go ahead and pop your email address in there too, just in case somebody, I see a lot of people writing. If you want to put it there directly, we can do that as well.
Yeah, and as we kind of close, I saw a cool quote around fasting being the physician within. So I thought that was a nice way to kind of
Yes. Who
end
said
it with
that?
everybody. Hippocrates.
Oh, nice. I love it. I love it. I'm going to put in there Dr. Mindy Peltz with the Fast for Like a Girl as well. So Sarah and I will talk offline if there's other resources. But if you all have nothing that you additional, you're welcome to ask anything before we pop out. And if not, I wish you a wonderful day. My gals in California, lucky you. Us in Maryland, we're still lucky, but it's rainy and humid and the hair is starting to frizz. So I appreciate all of you, and I look forward to seeing you in next month's Food for Thought session. Be safe, be healthy, and I will see you the next time.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Awesome.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're
You're
so
welcome.
welcome, Francis. Bye, Susie. You're so welcome. You guys take care.
You too. Happy wedding day.